Hello, everybody, and welcome to today's webinar featuring the esteemed Professor Jonathan Caulkins, where we will be discussing the future of cannabis policy in Australia. My name is Rhys Cohen, and I'm the Policy Officer at Penington Institute, and we are a not-for-profit organisation that's focused on supporting cost-effective approaches that maximise community health and safety in relation to drugs, including pharmaceuticals and alcohol, and of course, cannabis. Today I'm speaking from the lands of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, and I'd like to pay my respects to their elders past and present, and to acknowledge the traditional owners of the many lands from which we're all meeting on today. Welcome everyone to the fifth and final webinar in our series titled Global Perspectives on Australia's Cannabis Future, where we ask leading experts to share their cannabis policy insights from around the world and explore the big questions that need to be answered about how Australia could regulate the use of cannabis for adults. The format for today's webinar will be a slight departure from the previous webinars that we've had in this series. Over the last 4 sessions, we've had topics covering mental and physical health, public safety and amenity concerns, production and supply pathways, and taxation and pricing policies. Today, we're going to be starting off by exploring the topic of criminal justice and the lessons that Australia can learn from overseas experiences. And then to take maximum advantage of Professor Caulkins' expertise, we will also touch on several of the other topics I just mentioned and leave some time at the end to answer questions from the audience. So I encourage you to use the Q&A function to ask questions throughout today's discussion, and we will try to answer as many as we can at the end. So without further ado, I'm pleased to introduce our guest for today, Professor Jonathan Caulkins. John, would you like to briefly introduce yourself to the audience?
Happily, and let me say thank you very much for the invitation, and I'm delighted to be able to participate. I've been studying drug policy for about 35 years with a particular interest in cannabis legalization for 15. My shtick is thinking about supply. That includes the operation of the suppliers and also how they respond to changes in policy on the supply side.
Wonderful, thanks so much. Well, look, let's jump straight into it. And to start off on our final topic of criminal justice, I wanted to ask you right off the bat. Many people who support cannabis law reform point to the benefits of avoiding contact with the criminal justice system, such as avoided justice system costs and reducing downstream harms as a result of legalizing cannabis. In your opinion, how has this argument borne out so far overall?
Basically, it's a good argument. Just 2 caveats or 2 additions. One is sometimes people say, because of that, we must legalize. But in reality, decriminalization gets you 80% of the way. And the second point is sometimes advocates will exaggerate the potential benefits because they'll create the impression that every cannabis arrest was of a person who never encountered the criminal justice system before, and this arrest and this alone sends them hurtling down a trajectory of unending involvement with the criminal justice system. And it's not that bad. The most common outcome of a marijuana possession arrest in the United States is the charges are just dropped. They're never prosecuted. And things like the fear of blocking access to legitimate labor markets isn't really pertinent because that only kicks in with conviction. And then a whole bunch of other marijuana arrests happen because somebody was doing something else and they happened to be possessing cannabis at the time. And so then you sort of throw on a cannabis arrest. So advocates can oversell this, to be sure, but they're overselling something that is very real. And legalization has absolutely greatly reduced the number of people getting cannabis possession arrests.
Interesting. You mentioned that decriminalization might get you 80% of the way there. What's the 20% in your opinion, or what comes to mind?
Yeah, I don't want 80% as opposed to 81%. But the point is, in sheer number of arrests, most of the arrests are of simple possession. And as I said, it's sort of an accidental consequence of other interaction with the police. There are also arrests of suppliers. That would continue with decriminalization, but that's a smaller subset of the arrests. Suppliers dominate the people who go to prison, but in terms of arrest, even potentially conviction, and so those knock-on effects like having to report a conviction on a job application, a lot of that does come from simple possession, and decriminalization would remove those criminal charges.
Right, that makes sense. And I mean, once cannabis becomes lawful to possess and consume, then we can expect some debate about the issue of these historical convictions and people who've previously been convicted of simple possession or other offences. How have US states gone about managing this? Are there any good examples or best practices that you think other governments considering cannabis law reform should be following?
The short answer is sort of every state has done its own thing, and that's in part because of complicated constitutional law issues, by which I don't mean federal constitutional law. I mean the constitution of each individual states. But the takeaway lesson is if all you do is permit people to petition to have their record cleared, very few people will avail themselves of that opportunity, both because they may not have the resources to hire a lawyer and because person by person, it's not that important. So if you really want to make a big difference, you want to seek some form of automatic expungement as opposed to just making it possible to petition individual by individual for expungement.
Mm-hmm. And are there any examples of states that have chosen to go about that in a different way and it's produced a poor outcome? Or why wouldn't, I guess, sorry, a better phrasing of that question is why, that sounds like a pretty straightforward and practical approach. Why would governments choose to go about doing that in a different way, do you think?
I think the answer to that question is boring for your audience. That is, some states, early states thought, hey, all we need to do is make it possible to expunge, and just didn't realize that not everybody would take advantage of it. And then the other is, it turns out there are states where you literally can't even expunge the record. It's just like against the Constitution. And so then they have to get into things like sealing the records, which sort of accomplishes the same thing, but they're technically, but that gets into lawyerly stuff that I suspect doesn't translate from one country to the other.
Right. No, that makes a lot of sense. Thank you for that. And then beyond just removing historical convictions, it's also argued that, you know, the people and the communities that have been most impacted by the criminalization of cannabis should be compensated in some way, including through things like, you know, preferential licensing or other supports that allow them to participate in the new sort of regulated market. I know you and some of your colleagues from RAND covered this topic in a 2021 publication. So what do you think about that approach or those arguments, and what kinds of practical challenges does that tend to present?
Excellent question. Huge topic, enormously controversial. There are a couple of things that can very safely be said, and I'll start with those, and then maybe we'll get into some other matters too. The number one thing is who gets licenses does not matter to very many individuals compared to the numbers of people who were harmed in the past, and compared to the numbers of people who can be helped by automatic expungement. It's just a numbers game. There are literally millions upon millions of Americans who over time have received arrest or conviction for cannabis. Big numbers. The number of people who are going to get these equity licenses, even nationwide, is probably hundreds. Maybe it gets into low thousands, but it just doesn't affect very many individuals. Yet it totally dominates the debate. And I think it is misguided. It is a tragedy if we spend all our energy fighting over who gets which license and neglect what we spoke of earlier, which is clearing past records. Clearing past records matters for lots of people's lives. Who gets the shot to be a millionaire because they get the privileged business license is not a large numbers game. Right? So that's number one. The second point in the complication may also be an instance in where US law doesn't carry over, but I'll go ahead and explain it because in some version it might. Under US law, you cannot favor any protected class, say any race or group, unless that class was harmed in the past in that same activity or industry. So when somebody passes a careless social justice law, the people who are excluded from those benefits can file suits and say, it wasn't within this industry that the past bad behavior happened. The past bad behavior happened by law enforcement. And we're not now talking about who gets a license to be in law enforcement. We're talking about who gets a license to supply cannabis. And there wasn't a long historical pattern of discrimination within the legal cannabis industry because the legal cannabis industry didn't even exist. And that argument carries water in US courts. It doesn't always prevail, but at least gets a hearing. And that has created massive tie-ups in the courts that in some states have seriously hindered the ability to roll out licenses for anyone. So those two statements, I think, are both pretty clear.
And I think like New York's recent experiences come to mind, perhaps.
New York is a basket case example of this. And it's not, I want to be clear, I don't, for the most part, blame regulators. Regulators' heads have been on the chopping block, and they may have made some mistakes, but you're sort of dealt a raw hand when the law tells you you must go do something that the courts may find unconstitutional. You're sort of, the regulators trying to implement this are in a real tough spot.
Interesting. So there are clearly lots of technical and legal issues that emerge as a result of these choices, but primarily what I'm hearing you say is it's a small benefit for a large amount of effort that could otherwise be better spent expunging records or doing more things for more people. Is that your?
I think so. And now let me go beyond what's clear and say something that's highly controversial. In a free society, we generally require or depend upon the integrity and the honesty of regulated firms in order to get them to comply with regulations. We're not normally truly being a big brother. You don't normally have so many regulatory enforcement agents that they're looking over the shoulder of the regulatees, particularly if you make the licenses open. So there are large numbers of licensees. So we want the regulatees to be people of integrity. Some versions of the social equity are explicitly going out and trying to favor people who were breaking felony law in the past. I think that's something that should be thought about carefully. So some versions of social justice, it's just everybody who's within a demographic group. I'm not talking about that. But there are instances in which the explicit objective is to go out and seek people who, quote unquote, have legacy experience, i.e., they were drug dealers of illegal drugs, and say, we will preferentially give licenses to criminals. And that is, that's one way to think about it. But another way to think about it is if you want to have a well-functioning regulated industry, you want those people being regulated to be by character folks who are inclined to follow the rules.
Yeah, makes
and
sense.
We have in the United States, it varies a lot by state, but there are quite a few firms that have a bit of a cowboy mentality, a bit of a, if I can get away with it, it's okay. And it's an uphill slog for the regulators if that's the culture of the industry they are trying to regulate.
Thank you. One question that's just come to mind is sort of taking us back a few steps, talking about the role of cannabis incidentally appearing when people have police interactions. How does that work now in states where cannabis is legal? I mean, if someone is caught committing an offense of some kind and they happen to have cannabis on them, is that, it's that problem's been solved? It's no longer an issue or a consideration, or does that still play into the criminal justice outcomes that someone might expect from that interaction?
Short answer is yes. It's not a problem. The place where it could still be an issue is if you are on community release, either probation or parole, and the action violates your probation or parole conditions. And this could be true for alcohol too, right? Your conditions of release might say you will not drink. And then if you drink, you can be violating the conditions of parole. So I don't want to say it never shows up, but the short of it is the states that legalize genuinely legalize, and the federal government has never given two hoots about individual cannabis users outside of very unusual circumstances, like right at the international border or in a national park or something. So the federal government, like a rule of thumb in the past, would have been the federal government just didn't bother unless it involved at least 50 kilograms. They've never been interested in pursuing individual cases against users.
Got it. Thank you. And then in addition to addressing these historical harms, governments need to choose how to spend the money that they generate through regulating the cannabis market and how to reallocate law and order resources that might be freed up because of law reforms. We've had a conversation recently, John, about the scale or promised scale of those revenues, but whatever they are, they do exist at some level. What do you think should inform the choices that governments make about where to allocate these revenues? And are there any particular risks or concerns with utilizing revenues that come from the regulated cannabis market?
It's a great question. There's no challenge spending the quote unquote freed up law enforcement resources. Nobody's ever said we're having difficulty figuring out how to do that. And the couple of reasons. One is just not that large a share of criminal justice effort ever went into cannabis in the first place. But also there are almost no cannabis specific line items in anybody's budget. It's a patrol officer makes an arrest. Patrol officers have oodles of other things they can be doing with their time. And so they just go and do that. In terms of the tax revenue, so many of the US states legalized by voter proposition, which means an advocate effectively wrote a law and then the voters voted on it directly. And in those propositions, often the tax money would be earmarked to all sorts of heartwarming causes like K through 12 education, specifically in order to attract enough votes to get it to pass. And those tend to sort of be hardwired in then because that was part of the contract when it was passed. When there's flexibility, the tendency is to try to spend it on related topics just because for the average voter that seems to make sense. At some level, that isn't necessary. There's nothing wrong with saying the state has to pass all sorts of taxes on income, property, and so on. If we suddenly get a windfall source of revenue, we can just ease up the tax burden somewhere else and pay for general operating funds. The catch is that cannabis taxes end up being a very small part of a state's total revenue, less than 1% in most cases. The one lesson that I will say Australia should not make the mistake that some US states did is some of the US state laws said the cannabis regulators' funding will come from the regulated industry, either from taxes or from license application fees. But that means you can't hire the regulators before you've got the industry, and that's a disaster. You want the regulators to be in place, getting the rules all worked out before you start to have a regulated industry. So it's a bad thing if they are artificially handcuffed coming out of the box because they don't yet have the money to let them get started. So don't do that.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. But having an industry having a regulator that is funded through fees and charges on the industry that they regulate. That's how, for example, Australia regulates therapeutic goods at the federal level. And is that an inherent risk or something that you would recommend avoiding with the cannabis?
I mean, yes, I would intrinsically recommend avoiding it. One of the challenges that we've seen in the United States is regulatory capture. The industry having too much sway relative to public health or other interests over the regulators. And that is easy to happen in any industry. In this case, perhaps particularly so because nobody else has the technical expertise about things. So also making the regulators' revenue hostage to the industry, I think just is an extra unnecessary risk. I think the regulators should be funded out of the general fund to provide them with a degree of insulation against that. But I totally agree that for the average person, there's some poetic justice about not charging the taxpayer for, make the industry pay its own way sort of thing. But I'd kind of rather have the money from this specific industry go into the general purse, and then the money for the regulators come out of the general purse. I would prefer breaking that connection.
Yeah, thank you for that. And speaking of government revenues, policy analysts often recommend price management to discourage overconsumption in regulated markets. But don't artificially high prices just act as a regressive tax that punishes poor people or incentivizes people on lower incomes to continue purchasing cannabis on the illicit market? What's that tension like?
Yeah, so another lovely question. The basic theory here is that dependence-inducing intoxicants, be it alcohol, cannabis, their production and consumption creates both externalities, that is harms to third parties, impaired driving, for instance, and also can create internalities. That is, when it's things like cornflakes and shirts, we presume the consumers never make a mistake. They always make good decisions about how to spend their money. But with dependence-inducing intoxicants, where like half of the spending is by people who have a substance use disorder, sometimes people make decisions that their friends and family would say are actually not even in their own best interest. So that's the logic for making prices a little bit higher, which is to provide a compensating incentive to protect against some of those externalities and internalities. And it's good logic for it. We're probably all most familiar with that with tobacco and alcohol. Would the cannabis tax be regressive? Absolutely. At least in the United States, cannabis is a down market drug like tobacco smoking. It's not a rich person's drug the way alcohol is. So exactly because something like 60% of the consumption is by people with a high school education or less, then 60% of the tax burden would tend to fall on people with a high school education or less. The dollars involved are not driving the macroeconomy. The dollars involved are not going to shape income inequality for society as a whole, but they would tend to be regressive. Your last question is whether or not taxes risk exacerbating the illegal market. And the answer is, well, of course, on the margin, but that idea is massively oversold by the industry, which is selfishly trying to get the taxes reduced. So here's the proper pushback against the idea that, oh, excise taxes on cannabis are the reason that the legal supply is not fully displaced the illegal market. The reality is that a company that flouts all the laws can outcompete a legal company if we make no effort to make life difficult for the illegal company. And it's not primarily about excise taxes. It's about things like income and payroll taxes. It's about things like following environmental rules. I had a conversation with a gray market entrepreneur back in the day who was going to transition into the early state legal market. And he was going on and on complaining about the Americans with Disability Act, which would require him to install wheelchair ramps in his greenhouses. And that was going to drive up his cost structure. So following laws, following the rules increases the cost burden for a company. That's true for all sorts of things. And the excise taxes are a small part of that. So what's the answer? What's the antidote? The antidote to that is law enforcement can't sit on its hands. It has to actually enforce the regulations against people who are trying to break the rules. If we make no effort to make life difficult for rule breakers have an unfair advantage over rule followers. But exactly because post-legalization production is happening at scale, 100,000 square foot greenhouses, it is much easier to enforce than it is when it's hidden in surreptitious activity. And enforcement doesn't mean filling up prisons. Enforcement can mean seizing assets. So the big error, the catastrophic error, is thinking when we legalize, we can stop enforcing all laws. That's just an invitation to let rule breakers outcompete rule followers. And the industry will say it's all about taxes, but don't believe the industry. That's really not true.
Right. Are there any examples you can think of where the governments have taken, in your opinion, sufficient steps to police and prosecute the illicit market, or in your impression, have most states been pretty lackadaisical with it?
No, the states vary on this. I mean, heavens, that's part of the consequence of having 26 or whatever it is states. You get a big spectrum. So like Washington State happens to be a good state. I think in general, Canada is a good model of this. Now, I'll quickly say, it's not that the illegal market in Canada is zero. It takes time for the transition to happen. But you can absolutely shoot yourself in the foot if you have this mistaken notion that legalization means you don't have to put any energy into enforcing rules and regulations.
Right. That makes sense. And thank you for that. The in addition to those sort of law and order considerations and pricing, there are probably a bunch of other like non-price factors that could influence the speed at which people transition away from the illicit market. Things like store proximity or product variety, quality, packaging, etc. Do those sorts of factors contribute significantly to the transition away from the illicit market much, or what's your position on that?
Yeah, when you look at surveys of cannabis users and ask, for those who are not sourcing legally, why are they choosing not to? Convenience gets mentioned. The stores may be open from 6 in the morning until 11 o'clock at night, but what if you want it at 3 in the morning? That is a bit of an endogenous policy choice. For better and for worse, most state legal cannabis in both the United States and Canada is sold through dedicated bricks and mortar buildings that only sell cannabis products. And that's an extremely inefficient way to sell any consumer good. Imagine that there was a store that only sold breakfast cereal. And the only place you could get breakfast cereal was going into the breakfast cereal store. That would drive up the cost of breakfast cereal because the number of sales per staff hour is small compared to what a grocery store or a convenience store achieves. So if your sole objective is get rid of the illegal market, you would say not only is home delivery allowed, but we'd also just allow every grocery store and convenience store to sell the product. So anyway, price, yes. Convenience, yes. Some of it's habit. People, I still wear the same brand of blue jeans that I started to wear when I was 22 or something. I'm not the only person like that. When you read the consumer product marketing literature, part of why firms love to market at young people is we're all kind of sticky in our habits and preferences. So some of it's just, I've been buying from Joe for 10 years and I'm comfortable buying from Joe. The third consideration that gets some discussion these days, and I think it's worth discussing, although I'm not really sure on the evidence of this, is the idea that there's a latent demand for cannabis products from people who do not want to have the identity of being a cannabis consumer.
Hmm.
When you go into a cannabis only store, you're kind of making a statement. You're saying, I am part of that crowd. That is who I am. We don't require that of potato chip consumers. The potato chip consumer, by being able to just go to the grocery store, um, they're not like self-identifying as potato chip consumers. What is starting to happen in Minnesota in particular is THC adult beverages being sold in restaurants and bars, absolutely alongside an alcohol containing beverage. So you can just walk into a regular old restaurant and order a THC beverage along with your hamburger, and you didn't require having the self-image of I'm somebody who goes to a cannabis store. And I think that has a lot of potential to grow. I think it has potential to tap into a consumer base that isn't self-identifying as I'm a cannabis user.
Really interesting. I was not aware that that was the case in Minnesota. I always assumed it was a relatively conservative regulatory framework, but yeah, fascinating. Thank you for that.
Mhm.
And then in addition to regulated products, which is what we've been talking about, like most jurisdictions, especially in the US, have also permitted home grow or personal cultivation, which on one hand you could probably assist with the issue we've been discussing, transitioning people away from purchasing from illicit sources and making it affordable and accessible. But on the other hand, it kind of runs contra to the objectives of controlling and regulating the supply of cannabis. Have In your opinion, have home grow laws been successful in achieving their intended outcomes, whatever they may be? And would you recommend home cultivation be part of a framework for example, the Australian government?
I think that 10 years on, home grow matters far less than we thought 10 or 15 years ago when we were getting started. The reality is, if you just allow for-profit companies to grow in modern agriculture, science-based mass grows, they can put product out there that is better than what you grow yourself at far less cost than buying your own soil and fertilizer. And so the self-growing shrinks down to sort of a hobbyist kind of thing. The same people who grow carrots might think it's fun to grow their own cannabis, but it isn't competitive for the average consumer beyond that brief transition if you have full-on industrial supply. I do think an alternative to full-on industrial for-profit supply would be to be quite liberal about own grow, including the kind of co-op model you associate with Belgium and Spain, where you say 20 of you can all get together and maybe only one of you has actually got a green thumb, and that one person can kind of do the growing for the 20. I think it is possible to imagine that sort of cannabis club model undercutting an important share of the illegal market without making the jump over to a for-profit industry. And there's downsides to having an aggressive for-profit industry. So if you're trying to stay away from the for-profit industry, then how you handle the home growing matters. But once price per milligram of THCs drop by like 90%, why bother growing?
That makes a world of sense, assuming, like you say, assuming that those efficiencies that are gained through large-scale production are permitted to be passed on to consumers. Assuming governments don't hold a tight grip on pricing strategies and try to squeeze revenue wherever possible. Yeah, and there are probably some cautionary tales in Australia in particular around sort of tobacco pricing, for example, that come to mind. But yeah, it's part of the rich tapestry. moving on, I wanted to ask about in one of your recent articles, which I'll ask you about in a bit more detail shortly. You identify that daily and near daily use of cannabis in the US now exceeds that of alcohol. And most jurisdictions have a fairly well-established framework for dealing with alcohol impairment, but probably not for cannabis. So from a public policy perspective, do you have any suggestions on how governments can prevent cannabis impairment, say on roadside safety or workplace impairment?
So you can certainly bring a guest on who is more expert specifically on the impairment issue, but my understanding of the key takeaway is that just the physics of the cannabis molecules, or maybe I should say the pharmacokinetics and biology of them, make controlling impairment much more difficult than with ethanol. There's a whole bunch of reasons. First of all, there's only one ethanol molecule, whereas on the cannabis side, there's THC9, THC8, THCP, THC, and those various psychoactive cannabis molecules get metabolized into byproducts, some of which are inert, but some of which are themselves a psychoactive. So for instance, if you just do a simple plot of THC in blood over time, and also impairment over time, the THC drops away quite quickly. The THC is broken down, but the impairment doesn't drop when the THC drops. And also with alcohol, the ethanol molecule is a little molecule. And so now I'm sure I'm going to get the science way too informal here, but it just zips back and forth across the blood-brain barrier. So if you know what the ethanol content in the blood is, you know what it is in the brain. That's not true of a big old cannabis molecule. So I think there's just a whole bunch of reasons why the science is harder for coming up with that inexpensive, non-invasive roadside impairment test based on sort of biology or molecule count. And so I think you end up being pushed more into impairment measures. But then the challenge is the impairment doesn't always look like the impairment for alcohol. Right? So why does alcohol cause so many accidents? Part of it's reaction time. But honestly, if reaction time was the only thing that mattered for driving safety, 17-year-olds would be way better drivers than you or I are. They've got quicker reaction times. So with alcohol, it's stuff like suppressing prefrontal cortex and making you take risks. Well, that's not the mechanism of impairment for cannabis. For cannabis, it's stuff like just not paying attention and lack of ability to stay focused on a boring task. Well, so we don't have really great roadside tests for ability to stay focused on boring tasks. If the police officer is staring at you saying, you don't pass this, you're going to get arrested, that has an ability to focus your attention that is exactly what might be lacking when you're driving for 2 hours down a dark highway and starting to. So I think the whole topic is really very difficult. I wish it were easy, and I wish it were possible to just say, do what Idaho does.
Yeah, it's a challenge that we'll keep having to work through for many years to come. I fear, especially in Australia, where random roadside drug testing for THC presence is widespread and commonly implemented. Yeah,
and I think I took this totally in the direction of driving, but there's also other forms of impairment. So now that people are predominantly using cannabis daily and near daily, it's not just happening on weekends when people are socializing. So just stuff like the impact on short-term memory when you are under the influence matters because the consumption is happening during work hours or school hours. And so there's like impairment on things like short-term memory. Nothing we do in the alcohol impairment space about drivers speaks at all to, like one of the things that I talk about is steroids are a performance enhancer for physical athletics, or at least some physical athletics. Cannabis is not a performance enhancer for most cognitive tasks in a simple processing economy. Like a track coach might cheat by giving his athletes or her athletes access to steroids, but there's no chess coach out there slipping cannabis to chess competitors just before the tournament to try to give them an unfair advantage in terms of how many steps ahead they can think. And there's no debate coach out there slipping their debaters some cannabis on the side to try to help them make rhetorical points in a more concise way. So yeah, there's also a whole question about impairment totally different from the impaired driving or impaired operating of heavy machinery.
Right. Yeah, thank you. Moving on, because we do want to get to some audience questions, and please make sure that you put any questions in the Q&A function now. I wanted to ask you quickly about, despite cannabis being legally available in so many places in the US, very few jurisdictions have permitted things like cannabis cafes or lounges where people can lawfully consume cannabis that's not on their private residence. And so when people do consume cannabis in places where they're not permitted to do so, how should governments respond to that behavior? And how should governments address the differential impacts that public consumption laws might have on certain populations or types of people?
It's a great question. And of course, this is one where if you ask 7 experts, you'll get 9 answers. I'll just offer one perspective, which is my former colleague, Mark Kleiman, used the phrase grudging toleration after the repeal of prohibition. And the idea there was to not pretend that cannabis use is a innocuous or a virtuous thing that we want to promote. And so consistent with that would be the idea that we actually really don't want a lot of public consumption, because that normalizes the behavior in the eyes of youth, or for that matter, other adults. And so confining use to private spaces may be a reasonable compromise between prohibition, which is too expensive, and an unfettered embrace of what's ultimately dependence-inducing intoxicant that sometimes people make poor decisions over. But how would you enforce that? You can enforce it the same way you enforce open container laws. That can be a fine. It doesn't have to involve a criminal sanction. And if you are worried about income inequality effects of fine, some of the Nordic countries use a day fine principle, where instead of a fixed dollar amount, it's computed based on days of your income. So I personally would favor trying to not permit cannabis use in all places where kids, and frankly, just non-smokers who don't want to be confronted by it, are going about their daily business. But I think that can be addressed a little bit like littering is with fines.
Yeah, interesting. Yeah, I was aware of the Scandinavian fine approach when it came to driving infringements, but I hadn't thought about perhaps using it in the context of public possession or public consumption laws. That's an interesting.
I mean, it's not, to me, it's not a cannabis specific thing.
Sure.
I think day fines is a fantastic idea for all sorts of fines, but that's just my personal view.
And getting back to your recent paper, which found that rates of cannabis use in the US have fluctuated a lot over time and have grown rapidly, especially in recent years. The nature of the analysis in that paper didn't allow for sort of causal inferences, which may include things like patterns of cannabis use or sociocultural factors and government policy. Do you think we pay sufficient attention to non-policy factors when we're designing or assessing the performance of cannabis regulatory frameworks? And if so, is that a problem?
So first, the basic descriptive is from 1979 to 1992, cannabis use dropped by about 80%. That was a period of tightening policy. Then from 92 to 2022, we had a 20-fold increase in the number of people reporting use daily or near daily, a period of liberalizing. And that caution, which I'm glad you included, is that is just an association, no ability to draw causal inference. But to direct answer your question, yes, I think we are guilty of forgetting that it's not all about policy. I think that often the academics swoop in and say legalization is like a light switch, it's on or off, and we can just look at what use is the year after compared to the year before. And I think when you step back and look at this 43-year time horizon, you see instead that there's just generation-long evolution of use, of norms, behaviors, and ideas, and policy, and they all move together, and it's entirely possible that the arrows point in all sorts of directions. But I think there is a tendency to want to try to do that panel data set analysis to infer the causal effect of this policy and to neglect culture. And one of the meta stories with legalization is legalization creates a for-profit industry that is itself intentionally trying to alter culture. Think about the story of tobacco smoking in the United States in the 1920s. The tobacco industry basically looked back in a very self-satisfied way, said, excellent, we got a lot of men smoking our cigarettes. Darn, women aren't participating. Let's explicitly redesign our marketing to change social norms in a way that we add to our sales by changing the social position of our product. The industry becomes an active force in intentionally trying to alter the sort of cultural context of the thing that they're trying to sell. And that dynamic has been unleashed in the United States.
Interesting. Thank you for that. Finally, we'll this is a challenging question, but hopefully briefly. When you think about all the issues that we've discussed here today, is there a particular country or a jurisdiction that comes to mind that's regulated cannabis particularly well, in your opinion? What's the best example you might be able to point us to?
Quebec.
Why
the
Quebec?
Canadian province of Quebec is the winner on that.
What would be the top two things, two or three things
I
you think that
they
Quebec
have
has
kept
done?
public health front and center. All of Canada did a good job of a rational, deliberative, with public health at the table approach, and much better than the United States with its chaotic, dysfunctional state-federal inconsistency. But overall in Canada, the balance, in my opinion, favors industry, whereas Quebec, with its distinctive culture, has kept the reality of cannabis being a dependence-inducing intoxicant at the focus. So Quebec wins, in my view.
Thank you for that. Appreciate it. I'll go through some of the questions that have come through from the audience, and feel free to keep putting your questions in using the Q&A function as we go on for the last section of this webinar. So one question that comes from the audience is, should tobacco companies be permitted to participate in the cannabis industry? And I guess we could also expand that to, should regulators prohibit certain industries, including tobacco, but perhaps other industries, from participating in the regulated market?
In the US context, that question is moot because it is not something that the government would be allowed to ban. At present, the tobacco and alcohol industries have invested in the Canadian legalized firms, but not the US firms. But that's only because it technically continues to be illegal under federal law, and they don't want to jeopardize their existing markets. But the moment we legalize nationally, I don't really see a way to keep the companies from participating. You can continue to have a rule that says you're not allowed to create a product that includes tobacco and also cannabis. You can, in effect, force people to do it yourself. But Yeah, we are blessed and burdened by constitutional protections that extend to for-profit companies not being able to be blocked arbitrarily from otherwise legal actions.
But if you could, for example, in Australia, or if we were able to, from the outset, specifically exclude certain industries from participation, would you think that's a good idea or something that should be considered with caution?
I think the potential public health harms from overlapping products are great. I don't think tobacco. So the big asset that a tobacco firm would bring is expertise in brand management. Right? Producing marijuana, producing cannabis is not hard. So there does not require great expertise, easy to hire excellent farmers. The real crucial skill, if you want to become a multi-billion-dollar successful multinational cannabis corporation, is skill at brand management. Being able to purchase advertisement cheaply, do product placement in Hollywood movies, hire the right social influencers. The tobacco firms have that expertise, but there are plenty of other consumer product companies that have that ability also. So I don't think blocking the marketing geniuses who happen to currently work for tobacco firms means there will be no marketing geniuses coming into that new product space.
Interesting. Thank you.
That's just a thought. I could be wrong. I think it's a great question. It's fun to debate.
Right. A question that's come through about regulatory structures is, how does a standalone or dedicated cannabis regulator, like the one that's in place in New York, for example, compared to a state where regulation is split across several agencies as opposed to being centralized in a dedicated cannabis agency?
Boy, I think one of the things that we know now that I at least didn't think about in 2010 is how consequential it is of where we vest that regulatory power and responsibility. Different regulatory entities have different cultures, and those cultures matter. Our FDA is actively hostile to the tobacco industry. The Interstate Commerce Commission, no reason any of your readers would know this, but it was a railroad regulatory body that was totally captured by the railroad industry. It completely served railroad interests. And then we have the FAA, it's our aviation regulation entity, has an explicit dual mission of protecting the flying public and promoting the aviation company's interests. I mean, those choices really matter. And cannabis is quite complicated. Like, it is an agricultural product, so when you're deciding what pesticides to allow, why not let the agriculture department do it? But it's also a food. And so if you're talking about regulating foods, why not the same people who regulate restaurants? But it's also a smoked product that contains carcinogens. So I am glad for the question. I think the choices are quite consequential. And yeah, pros and cons of different approaches to that.
Interesting. Thank you. Another question that's come through is going back to illicit markets. Is there any information or research about post-legalization changes in illicit market dynamics, like the role of criminal organizations versus, producers selling out the back door, for example? That's the question.
Sure. The information's all lousy, of course, because you're talking about illegal activity. But in general, illegal supply in the United States does not look like organized criminal organizations in Mexico shipping in the way that might have been the case back in 2000. There are, so very briefly, there's actual licensees selling out the back door. Then there's people who look just like them and are operating in sort of the same way, and it's the same sort of background, but selling purely illegally. Then we've got all sorts of activity that is exploiting a loophole in this thing called our Farm Bill. We passed a bill that said, hey, if it's got less than 0.3% THC, we're going to call it hemp. You can go do that however you want because we want you to be able to make shirts and ropes and so on. It's been a complete disaster. In the first place, if you've got something like a candy bar or a gummy, that's a heavy thing. So you can put 10 or 20 or 50 milligrams there and have it be less than 0.3% by weight. So there are all these candies and gummies being sold that are Farm Bill compliant, but that wasn't the intention. And now what a lot of folks are doing are they're just plain old growing cannabis, same stuff anybody else would, but they're saying, no, not much THC. It's only THCA. It hasn't been decarboxylated yet, so it's hemp bill compliant. And then there's a whole big industry of people growing plants with lots of CBD and not much THC. And then they convert the CBD into Delta 9, if you're lucky. But more often, they're converting it into Delta 8 and saying, see, no Delta 9 here. There's an absolute wild west of people exploiting loopholes in the Farm Bill. And that's probably the biggest unregulated market by far at this point. And nothing like people with submachine guns in traditional organized crime mode.
Interesting. Thank you. Yeah, it's I'm grateful that we don't have similar confusion in Australia with regards to our hemp laws.
Yeah, make sure you don't ever do anything first because you can learn from other people's
We never
problems.
do, John. We never do. We're Australia. There are a couple of questions that came in about which are explicitly US questions, which we'll probably finish on, which are to do with the recent rescheduling announcement by the FDA. Will this rescheduling, assuming it goes through, because I know it hasn't been implemented yet and probably won't be for a few years, will this matter? What will the impact of this be? Will this lead to changes in prosecutional law enforcement, or what's your take?
Oh man, it's a great question. I guarantee you nobody knows. And this is another one of those instances where all the details of the law really matter. All right, so real quick, Schedule 1 is for all substances with no federally recognized medical benefit, not just hard drugs. So it's sort of a myth that it was unconscionable to put cannabis there. It didn't mean anybody thought cannabis was like heroin. It just meant the federal government did not recognize a medical use. Moving it over to Schedule 3 puts it exactly where synthetic THC has been for decades. So no change in anybody's judgment about how dependence inducing it is. But what that literally would be a statement of is that botanical cannabis has potential as a medicine, not just synthesized molecules that are controlled. However, it still isn't legal. And so, first of all, that's only medicine. It has nothing whatsoever to do with non-medical. And also, absolutely nothing in the state licensed medical would be compliant with the laws that apply to all the Schedule 3 drugs. Like, you're supposed to follow good manufacturing practices that guarantee the same dose from dose to dose. None of this stuff meets that sort of criteria. Furthermore, it isn't yet got an FDA approval for any specific indication. So it's enormously symbolically meaningful. It does have weird effects, like it reduces the tax burden because of a crazy thing called 280E. Only Americans speak of laws with section numbers. So high visibility, high symbolic value. It does not mean legalization. It doesn't have any direct effect on non-medical legality. Only in America can the laws be so confusing. But it's a great political action.
It'll be an interesting one to watch.
Yes, because so much now depends on what the FDA does. In the past, the Food and Drug Administration said it's Schedule 1. We have nothing to do with Schedule 1 because we only regulate drugs. Now, all of a sudden, it's a drug. What's the FDA going to do? It doesn't want to touch this. It's a royal pain in the neck for the FDA. So I don't think anybody really knows how energetically. I'll stop there.
Well, thank you so much, John. Really appreciate your time. That's brought us to the end of the hour and the end of the webinar. So it's just once again to say thank you so much for your time and your thoughts and your contributions. We really appreciate it. And to everyone listening, you can access the previous 4 webinars in this series on the Penington Institute website, or of course you can reach out to us directly and we'll point you to where you can watch those recordings, as well as this one, which will be online in the next day or 2. Thanks so much for your time and enjoy your days.
My pleasure. Have a good day.